I'm Phil Rickaby, and I've been a writer and performer for almost 30 years. But I've realized that I don't really know as much as I should about the theatre scene outside of my particular Toronto bubble. Now, I'm on a quest to learn as much as I can about the theatre scene across Canada. So join me as I talk with mainstream theatre creators you may have heard of and indie artists you really should know, as we find out just what it takes to be stage-worthy. If you value the work that I do on Stageworthy, please consider leaving a donation either as a one-time thing or on a recurring monthly basis. Stageworthy is created entirely by me, and I give it to you free of charge with no advertising or other sponsored messages. Your continuing support helps me to cover the cost of producing and distributing the show. Just 4 people donating $5 a month would help me cover the cost of podcast hosting alone. Help me continue to bring you this podcast. You can find a link to donate in the show notes, which you can find in your podcast app or at the website at stageworthy.ca. Now, on to the show. Bronwyn Steinberg is a theatre director and community builder and the artistic director of Calgary's Lunchbox Theatre. She's passionate about making theatre an inclusive gathering space where stories are shared that celebrate the diversity of human experience. In this conversation, we talk about the Calgary theatre scene, how Lunchbox Theatre has been a hub for new play development, how Bronwyn found her way to Lunchbox Theatre, and much more. Here's our conversation. So, Bronwyn, thank you so much for joining me. Why don't we get started? Because since I live in a bit of a Toronto, Ontario bubble, I'm not familiar with some of the theaters outside of what I know, and I've not heard of Lunchbox Theatre. So, tell me about Lunchbox Theatre.
Sure. Well, Lunchbox Theatre is kind of an institution out here in Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary. Lunchbox has been around for 47 years, and we do one-act plays, and we do them at lunchtime. So the idea from the founders was really to provide a different option for theater for downtown office workers and shoppers and whatever. And so the plays used to be pretty strictly like between 45 and 50 minutes because people could like clock in and out of their offices and get there for lunch, which I think is really lovely and sweet, but totally not the way things work anymore. So we could do a little bit over an hour if we need to, because we know that most people are probably not like punching a card when they go back to work. But we still do our plays at lunch, and it's just people can eat their food in the theater. And so we try to have a really sort of welcoming vibe. And one of the things I love about it is having that one-act format, and during the day, it's just accessible in a really different way than other kinds of professional theater. There's whether it is people fitting it in on a lunch break from work, or seniors, who might have to go to the theater with like, a support worker or something like that. Like different people can go to the theater than maybe your typical crowd in the evening. And of course, we get the typical theater going crowd as well, but it's nice to be sort of a different offering in terms of accessibility. And again, our shows, we try to make them really inclusive and welcoming. And that's not only the environment and the format, but also the kinds of stories that we like to tell.
It's fascinating that to me that Lunchbox Theatre has this long history. In Toronto, there was a company many years ago. Well, I say many years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. They tried doing something similar in the business district, and they didn't last very long. And I think it's wonderful to hear about a company that has found success doing that for like the lunchtime crowd and things like that. What do you think is behind the success of the longevity of Lunchbox Theatre?
Gosh, such a good question. And I don't know. It's sort of hard to say because like the feeling of the kind of audiences we're reaching here in Calgary is not that different than what I could imagine in Toronto. So I also don't know why it hasn't sustained itself there, you know? I think in the early years, especially because we used to be located really close to like the sort of business centers and lots of office towers and things, that audience really became quite loyal. And I don't know, I guess I've found when I've heard, you know, people talk about like the art scene in Perth, Australia, or, you know, like places that are a little bit more away from the sort of cultural centers, I think that there's an amazing thing where people really do come out for the arts, because they're excited that it's actually happening in their own community. And nowadays, Calgary's got tons going on, so we really are a cultural center here. But I think that those early days in the 70s, it was probably quite a special thing to have any kind of professional theater, as the different theaters here were popping up. And so I think it established Lunchbox as just this kind of beloved tradition. And even though we're in a different location now, so we have a little bit less proximity to like the office workers, it kind of doesn't matter because the work culture has changed so much anyway in terms of people working from home, or like I was saying before, like the kinds of hours that people work. I feel like it doesn't really make that big of a difference that we're no longer in that previous location. But I think that was part of it. And also there was a great deal with the city back in those days. I think for many years, that location, the Lunchbox rented for something like $1. You know, and we don't have that set up anymore. But I think that the sort of support that came from both local government and also the business sector in the 70s and 80s really built quite an amazing and robust theater scene here. And so Lunchbox was part of that.
I think I think one of the reasons why that sort of lunchtime theater didn't succeed here is because it was too new. Nobody really done it before, and it takes time to build up an audience for that. And they didn't have that kind of like, hey, you know, cheap rent or like subsidized rent. They had to pay like full retail rent in the main business area. So like it makes sense that they didn't have the opportunity to flourish. But I think it's such a great idea to be able to bring theater to people at that level, because I think sometimes evening theater has a barrier. You know,
I think so. Yeah. Well, and especially in cities where the people don't live as much in the sort of cultural district areas. And so if you get home from work and have to commute back to downtown or something, you know, there's a lot of weird little barriers you don't think of like that.
Yeah. I think that we often don't think about those. I mean, I've been very aware of over the last few years of how going to the theater also means going out for dinner, finding parking, all these other things that you have to do, which at the end of a workday, you're just thinking like, is this really how I want to spend my evening? You know, and to bring it to people at lunch is a great little thing. Now you do mostly, am I correct? Mostly like new Canadian work.
Yeah, we don't do exclusively new Canadian work, but it's definitely an emphasis of our programming. And we have a festival developing new Canadian work that's been around for 35 years now, the Stage 1 Festival of New Canadian Work. And that was created, I guess the founders kind of realized there wasn't as many one-act plays to do as Lunchbox needed, because Lunchbox was busy and doing a lot of plays. So they realized, hey, we need to actually develop this work. And now it's become such a great kind of breeding ground for new Canadian plays. And a lot of playwrights really get excited to sort of at the one-act form and giving that kind of structure a try before they want to write a full-length play or whatever. And our venues have always been quite simple. So like technical elements need to be a bit, you know, within reason. And we tend to do small cast shows. This, like right now we're doing, you know, about 4 actors is kind of our max. And over time, I think I've seen photos from earlier seasons at Lunchbox, or maybe they'd have like 6 actors, but generally a smaller, more contained kind of structure, which I think a lot of playwrights benefit from practicing. And, you know, sometimes the right sort of breeding ground for that is like a fringe festival or the fringe circuit. But sometimes you want something that's kind of not, I don't know, doesn't have the same kind of fringe appeal, but could have a different appeal. And I feel like those Lunchbox has been a great place to develop all kinds of different stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know what you're saying about Fringe, because I was just thinking as you were describing that in many cases the one act play doesn't get a lot of respect. Not
Hmm.
in the professional worlds. Often in like some of the, there's all these festivals. They're often student festivals or quote unquote community and things like that. But a lot of times the one act outside of Fringe doesn't get a lot of respect. And in Fringe, because that's pretty much all you can do in Fringe. So it's really fascinating to me that that's, and I think it's great that's sort of like you fostered that, because it is a great way for a playwright to learn to tell a story before expanding into a 2-act format.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's like short story writing versus novels. In some ways it's harder because you have to, be more direct and to the point. The story has to have its whole arc, but it has to do it in less time. But of course, now we love watching sort of TV that's got
Hmm.
that 55-minute length like that.
Yeah.
You could tell a lot of story in under an hour. And I think our audiences and I mean ourselves, we're quite drawn to that time frame these days. And it's funny because I'm often trying to think like, how can we at Lunchbox like market the shows according to the it's only an hour. Because it doesn't sound like, I don't know. I don't want it to sound like we're sort of degrading our work by saying that. But actually, when I'm scrolling through Netflix, when I see a show is an hour, I'm like, sweet.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
actually a really great length for our attention spans. And again, like you can get a full story in it, but you have to write it really tightly. And I think that's such a good exercise for playwrights.
It's an excellent exercise. Like the ability to write a tight 1-act play, like you can only that can only improve your writing. I was thinking about how you were saying, it's only an hour, which is like the kind of thing where you're like telling an audience, like, don't worry, we're only going to torment you for 50 minutes and then you can go, it's like that
Exactly.
kind of thing. But that's, it's hard to sort of sell the short time frame without sounding like that, because it's a
Yeah.
selling point,
It's
but it's
totally a
also,
selling
yeah,
point, but how
yeah,
do you phrase it?
yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good question. How do you phrase it?
I don't know. I mean, we make sure it's just like clear on our materials what our runtime
Mm,
is so people can see that.
yeah,
Especially our current show actually runs an hour 5. So our longtime Lunchbox patrons need to know it's actually over an hour so they can plan for like parking and stuff.
that's true.
But most new patrons, that to them, it's not really any difference if it's 55 or 65 minutes. But yeah, so we make sure the runtime is easy to find. Um, but mostly we try to focus on kind of the effect of what we hope people will walk away with. Our
Mm,
sort of tagline this season is lunch for your soul.
mm.
Because all of our plays that we're doing, I think hopefully feel like a bit soul expanding. They're really stories of human connection. I mean, it's theater, so that's a lot of stories. But yeah, that it's we also try to not have our plays be too heavy lifting.
Mm.
Like in the middle of the day, you want to feel good when you leave going back to work or on about your errands or whatever. You want to be still talking about the story or still thinking about these characters, but like with a bit of a glow. So I definitely look for plays that leave you with a real sense of optimism. That doesn't mean there can't be any heavy lifting, but we need to like get there to a place of warmth and optimism.
Yeah, you kinda, especially in the middle of the day, you kinda do have to send them back to work feeling like they can continue their day.
Exactly.
Um, are there things that you look for in the one-act plays that Lunchbox Theater does?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, that thing I was just describing of that kind of sense of optimism and connection is really important to me. Um, we do love comedies, musicals, and love stories. Again, like it's lunch. We want to have fun. Um, if it's like an exploration of an identity kind of play, I don't want it to be sort of like a trauma identity piece. I would like it to be a more joyful kind of thing. Um, Again, a tight story, well told, manageable number of characters, um, setting requirements that allow us to really play in the small space that we have. Like, I love scenic design that's a bit more presenting kind of a fun visual metaphor rather than having to be fully realism, which I think also works well with the one act format often. I mean, sometimes you want it to just be kind of a kitchen sink, very realistic kind of house setting. But I don't know. I feel like I've been drawn to plays that have a little bit more, room for metaphor and playfulness, which is maybe more my own aesthetic than just Lunchbox. But something I keep coming back to is a feeling of elegance.
Right.
And not like fancy elegance, but like simplicity and beauty in the storytelling. So again, a clear thrust to the story, characters that do go on a journey and that we really understand and relate to, and in a place that we can make sense of, like with some sense of, I guess I keep saying the same thing, playfulness and metaphor, but like in a way that doesn't need a whole bunch of stuff to make it happen. I don't need, a heavy piece.
Right. Now, my experience with theater in Calgary is, like, as I said, quite limited. I was in Calgary for the Calgary Fringe about 12 years. It was a long time, a number of years ago with a show, and I didn't. Fringe is so intense that you often don't get a sense of what the theater scene of the city that you're in actually is like. Where does, aside from nurturing playwrights and sort of like being a starting point for a lot of playwrights, where does Lunchbox Theater sit in the Calgary theater ecosystem? What does it bring? What does it nurture? What does it do aside from the playwrights aspect?
Yeah, well, it's kind of that way for all artists, which is really special. When I first arrived here 2 years ago, it was, we were deep in pandemic lockdown times. So we weren't doing shows yet. So I had a little bit of time to get acclimated as I was kind of taking the reins of Lunchbox Theater. And so I put out a call to the community that if anybody just wanted to meet me on Zoom, they could. And I ended up having about 200 20-minute Zoom meetings over a course of a few months. And that was one of the questions I was asking people, because I wanted to know about their relationship to Lunchbox, but also like about what they appreciated or loved about that relationship, because I want to make sure that we keep doing that if we're doing something well. And I heard so many people from every discipline within theater saying that Lunchbox was where they had their first professional gig, whether it was as an actor, stage manager, designer, director. And so it's always been a place where emerging artists have really been supported, but a fully professional environment at the same time. So it's not, it's not like people feel like they're working with recent graduates and a couple mentor teaching artists. It's still, even if you're an emerging artist, you're in a fully professional show. And again, because we're a PAC member professional company, where it's not the kind of vibe of rehearsing for a fringe show, which can be, of course, all over the map. It can be extremely professional, or it can be extremely ad hoc in your own basement or whatever. So we have all the supports of being on an equity contract and all those things, but there just always has felt, and this is what I kept hearing from people, that they've always felt really, really welcome at Lunchbox and really supported. And that's so awesome to me. I just am so excited to be a part of that. And we've even kind of been expanding our support for emerging artists this year. We have a new program that has even more emerging artists with us than usual, which is awesome. But it's definitely been that place within the Calgary theater ecology, is a place where people do get a chance, and also where people love coming back to work. And artists that are, that have been doing the work for decades, love getting a chance to come back and do a show at Lunchbox, even if they haven't been there since they were an emerging artist or whatever. Especially if they have families. Like, the shows are at noon and they're an hour. So once you're in run, like, it's a pretty sweet work day.
Yeah.
And you can pick your kids up from school, or whatever it is you need to do. And you can be home with them in the evening, or take them to another show. Or some of the artists who have been working at Lunchbox since the 70s were telling me that in those days when the when the casting pool was smaller, they would be doing a show at Lunchbox in the day and rehearsing a show at one of the other companies in the evening, which I think is kind of amazing. But now we've really, like, along with Patty, our general manager, she and I really agreed on kind of taking advantage of those aspects of the Lunchbox model, with the fact that you can sort of balance your life a little bit more. And so we're like, and we only do one-act plays.
Yeah.
So we are doing the 5-hour or 5-day work week. And we're doing no 10 out of 12s. We're doing those things and trying to make, even before we open, try to make our workspace kind of more balanced and nurturing, which is really cool. And I'm really proud of that work, and also feel like if a one-act company can't be a leader in more humane work practices, then we're all screwed. So, like, not only do I believe in it, but I also feel like obligated almost in a good way, because I think those are changes our industry needs. But yeah, if we can't manage it, then it's true that we really need to rethink everything about what we do.
And you think the genuine question, you think that you're successfully navigating that?
I'm about to open a show tomorrow that we very successfully rehearsed in 5-day work weeks. And, we teched this week because, it's a small show. So we did tech last week and then into previews this week. So it wasn't a super long process. We never stayed after 6, except for one night when there was painting that needed to happen, but painting has to dry overnight. So we did the paint call, but we accommodated the day then. We knew that those people were going to be painting. And I'm really proud of it. It's a beautiful little show. It's a 1-act musical. There's 10 songs in it, 4 actors and 2 musicians, a whole bunch of lighting cues. It's not like we didn't do a full, solid, beautiful show. We just did it in a manageable way.
Huh. Wow. Imagine. You mentioned you joined during the pandemic, and the pandemic was like a great interrupt for the whole theater world. What was the impact of the pandemic on Lunchbox Theater?
Well, it was pretty huge. To be honest, pre-pandemic, Lunchbox was not in the healthiest place financially and in terms of work practices. Like, we used to have our own venue, and having your own venue kind of means you need to keep it full all the time. So we did a lot more shows, and we also had to kind of have our own relationship with renters using it when we weren't using it. And the staff was bigger because of, needing to have our own technicians and box office and, all those people. And it's in some ways a shame that we don't have that structure anymore. But the venue's lease was up in September of 2020, and the board just decided to not renew it. And our old venue is in the base of the Calgary Tower and directly across the hall from Vertigo Theatre, who are our great friends. They do mysteries, which is awesome. And they have a much bigger facility. They have the Vertigo Playhouse, which I think is around 400 seats. And then they have a studio that's 130 seats. And they spoke with our staff and with the board and said that they would allow us to be kind of primary renters of their studio space. And so we get kind of first dibs at the calendar once they know when they need it. And so now we're producing across the hall. So not a disruption really to our patrons. If any of them still don't know we moved, then all we have to do is say, turn around, look at the door on the other side. So our patrons have found their way, and their facility is beautiful. And now we give their brilliant staff more hours. And we have a smaller staff. So because of the pandemic, we've really completely refigured the way we work. We're doing 4 shows a season instead of 8 or 9. We're doing them in this rental venue, which is in some ways a better setup for us because they have really good equipment. They have a little bit more seating capacity. We only had 100 seats before, and now we got 120, 130. And we have this really lovely, supportive relationship with Vertigo. And that's something I also really feel in the Calgary theater ecology is really nice, is that I feel like the different companies in town actually like each other and support each other in a really nice way, which is awesome. So we've had some sort of major changes, and we now only have a full-time staff of 3.
Mm.
But then we have a bunch of part-time contract folks, as well as our, contractors on individual shows and things. So we still have quite a lot going on, but we're trying to do fewer things and do them better,
Mm.
which I think is not a bad shift in our industry in general.
It's not bad at all.
Yeah.
You mentioned the theater companies in Calgary sort of like liking each other.
Yeah.
And I have for years been operating with sort of like this idea, and it was actually inspired on the fringe circuit. A fabulous fringe artist, Cameron Moore, my first time at the Montreal Fringe, had this seminar, and the first thing that she said was, "There's audience enough for everyone. We're not in competition." And I've really sort of held on to that. I occasionally have mentioned that to people, and I get pushback from them. Because they sort of, it's the idea, the idea that the audience, where is our audience going is the question that we're always asking. And we're losing our audience. And so that makes people think that they're in competition. And I really don't think that that's the case generally. I think that audiences that go to see good theater continue to see good theater.
Absolutely. And the more good theater anyone is making,
Mm-hmm.
the more people will be interested in good theater, because they'll be, they see my show and they're like, oh, that was cool. Then they hear about another show and they might go to that too. It's not like, oh, I already saw theater, I'm done for the year. you know? I think instead it's totally the opposite. Like, oh, I saw this play and it made me feel things and I had a
Yeah.
good time and I laughed and, I kind of want to do more of that.
Yeah.
I mean, Calgary's neat because the 4 bigger companies are all really different in what we do. So we really aren't in competition. Like I said, our closest colleagues are the ones that we share space with. Vertigo, they do mysteries and
Mm.
they do big main stage productions. Right now, they're doing Murder on the Orient Express, this huge 12-person cast. There's a train on stage. It's beautiful. It's such a different experience than our warm holiday Christmas musical, that we're doing, which is so charming. I don't even like Christmas and it's so charming. But it's such a different feeling that yes, they'll appeal to very different people. The people who love theater will come to both, but also there's room to then, for the people who don't already come to theater, for the ones who are like, ooh, I love murder mysteries, I love Agatha Christie, they'll go see the Vertigo show, and that's
Yeah.
awesome. I don't need them to necessarily come to see my Christmas musical. But then there's going to be people who are like, oh, Christmas musical, that's so fun. And they'll come to mine and maybe they don't want to go to a murder mystery. That's okay too, And then the other bigger companies, Theatre Calgary and Alberta Theatre Projects. I mean, Theatre Calgary is a big A-house main stage place where they do big scale musicals and they do classics, or they do newer Canadian works that are partnering with, Can Stage or Arts Club or whatever. So that's a really particular, different kind of theater going experience where people are like, yeah, I want to go in the fancy lobby and be there at night and all that stuff and have the kind of big theater experience. And then Alberta Theatre Projects has also a great tradition of developing new Canadian plays, that ones that are maybe a little bit edgier than we do at Lunchbox and certainly aren't 1 hour and things like there's room for all of us.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. You mentioned, somebody seeing their play for the year. And I feel like some people do that because I think they get the idea that theater is expensive. Maybe they saw a Broadway show and they paid out of the wazoo for those tickets, or they were in Toronto and they saw a big Mervish show and I can only afford to do that once a year. But there's so many companies that are more affordable in the way that if you take the family to see a movie now and then, you can get the same, you can see a show. And I think that there's, it's available. But sometimes I think the theater doesn't do a great job of sort of up talking itself, selling itself as a form of entertainment that is, you could do that in the evening. You can see the movie, but you can also see something really cool over here.
Yeah, totally. And that's something I feel like we could do better in collaboration. as a theater community. I don't know how. I don't have like the answer for that. But I think, you're right that as a kind of sector, we could
Mhm.
we could do better at
Yeah.
talking that up. I mean, it's funny though, here in Calgary, your parking is going to cost more than your theater ticket, which is uh, which is a problem
That
actually.
is a problem. That is a real problem.
Yeah. But like, we are that's another thing that we want to be accessible. So our tickets are lower. Also like our shows are smaller and shorter. So like it does feel that you can't ask people to pay like $80 for a
No.
musical that's just
Mm.
only 55 minutes long, you know?
Yeah. Now you mentioned recently joining Lunchbox Theater. Uh, where were you before, and what brought you to Lunchbox?
Yeah, so I mean, this job brought me here. I was actually born in southern Alberta, closer to Lethbridge, and my mom's a professor at the University of Calgary. So Alberta has always been kind of one of my homes, but I hadn't actually lived here for more than maybe 2 months in the summer until I took this job. But when I saw the job was up, it was like, oh, what an exciting opportunity! I'd kind of had my eye on Calgary for a while because I had been here enough to really get a sense of how exciting the theater community here was and also had family connection. But I actually came here from Ottawa, where I was for about 12 years. I went there to do my master's in directing, my MFA at Ottawa U. And when you go somewhere to do a 2-year program and then you find yourself there 12 years later, because you started doing all kinds of things. So yeah, I was in Ottawa for that amount of time. And while I was there, I created an indie theater series called Tactics, which is a project I'm really proud of and is still operating in Ottawa, which is great. When I came to Lunchbox, I had a few other artists sort of take the lead, and now we incorporated as a not for profit um, about a year before I left, and so I'm actually now on the board, which is fun that I can still support from away, but also see it grow and change under new artistic leadership is really fun. But Tactics is does a lot of things that are kind of similar to Lunchbox, which is, I guess, why it felt like such a natural kind of progression for me in terms of it is a place where independent artists and emerging artists can kind of grow into their professional practice. But it's really a home for the kinds of shows that maybe don't fit at the fringe because maybe they're 2 acts or maybe they have a complicated set design or whatever. So it's kind of a subscription series or not always actually the subscriber model, but a kind of a series of indie shows that happen in the same venue and have a bit of support and they're curated. But the shows generally still have a full sort of production run. It's not unlike kind of the Riser project and kind of some of those things that have
Mm.
been happening in Toronto.
Mhm.
It's not exactly the same model, and we happened kind of in parallel. So it's been neat to see how it's happening in other places. Saskatoon has something called the Live Five, which I was also really inspired by when I heard about it.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's a place where indie artists can get some of the similar kind of support you would have at the Fringe, but to be able to do a main stage show.
Hmm.
And then in addition to main stage programming, there's also development programming and community building kind of programming. They have the development series, the main stage series, and then the community building. We call it the green room series. And so different events, like things like a grant writing workshop or something, but also like an office holiday party for artists who don't work in offices,
Hmm.
or things like that.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
That was a long
Now,
answer.
I love it. I love it. Speaking of where you've been, one of the things that I really love to hear about are people's theater origin stories. The thing
Mm.
that made you, or the journey that brought you from decide, like, how did you discover theater? How did you decide that it was going to be a thing you did, and what was that journey like?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny. I mentioned my mom is a professor at the University of Calgary. She's a professor of education. And before she was a prof, when she was still a teacher in schools, she was a drama teacher. So basically, from when I was about 6 on, she took me to rehearsals with her. So I kind of just grew up thinking when you grew up, when you grew up, you'd become a theater director because that's what grown-ups do. They direct plays. So that's kind of where I started. But along the way, I focused more on acting for undergrad and for a few years after I graduated. And I I don't know if I was it's hard to know if I was like in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe I'm not actually a very good actor um, or if I wasn't patient enough or what, but I didn't feel like, I don't know, I was getting a lot of great work in TYA, which is really fun. But I didn't know sort of where to go next as an actor. And I was living in the US at the time because I'm a dual citizen. And then I was invited to be an assistant director for that TYA company I worked for. And that was really cool. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm really interested in directing. And then that went well. So they invited me back to direct. And I directed a 2-person version of A Christmas Carol that went to toured to elementary schools and middle schools all over the US. And the way they worked is because it was a 2-person show, they would have multiple 2-person teams that would all be touring the show in different regions. So that season, I directed 9 2-person teams. And
Wow.
it was so much fun. We would have a separate rehearsal for each team. So we basically were on a 3-day cycle, and they were doing 2 shows. So they would have like day 1, they'd have a 3-hour rehearsal with me. Day 2, they'd have a 3-hour rehearsal on their other show. And then day 3, they'd have the day off. And then meanwhile, I would do the same rehearsal 9 times in a row. But I would do it, team ABC on day 1, DEF or whatever on day 2, and so on. And I found through doing the same show with 9 different pairs of actors that it was really neat to be able to dig into the same story and try to have basically similar blocking and the same set and costume design and everything, and same show, but really honor the actors' different energies and the way each team of actors work together. And I just, maybe also because of my background as an actor, I just really admire and respect that how actors collaborate with the director. And I found that I just loved it. And I was like, okay, well, I'm more of a director than an actor. So I went to grad school, and 12 years went by, and here I am. Yeah, but my earliest origin is like, actually, I went to rehearsal when I was 6 with my mom.
Interesting. Do you have a memory of the first thing that you recall being rehearsed?
Like as a little kid?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, she was doing Grease at a high school. And actually, I don't know if you know, Kari Matchett was in that cast, and she's you'll recognize her on lots of different TV things.
Right.
But she was in that high school, and she and my mom are actually still friends, and I'm friends with her now too. But I remember going to rehearsal, and I remember, I don't know, I guess the image I have of Grease in my head, it's hard to know what's like funny photos I've seen in the family and what's actually a memory. But I think I really remember the song Freddie, My Love being rehearsed. And I think I remember that because it's not in the movie, is it?
It's one of those songs in the movie that's actually, and I'm such a nerd for knowing this, it's played in the background over the radio.
Right. But they don't do the whole thing.
No, they don't do the whole thing.
Yeah. And I have this image of seeing these high school girls doing the whole thing. So I think that image comes from rehearsal.
Nice. That's awesome.
That was always a song that I was like, yeah, I love that song. And then it's like, I watch the movie, I'm like, hey, where is that?
There are a bunch of songs that are great songs that are not in the movie, but if you bought the movie soundtrack, they're on there.
Ah, okay. Good to know.
Because I don't know, they recorded them, so they kept them.
Right.
They were able to do a double album because of those, and
wow.
sell them more expensively. Just coming back to Lunchbox Theatre, I know that, and one of the things I've talked with a few people about mentorship as far as like the future of leadership in the theater. There were a number of years that I remember living through where a theater company in Canada would be looking for a new leader, and they would find one, but never in Canada. They would bring somebody from the States. They would bring somebody from England, things like that. And we're seeing more and more now the companies who have Canadian leaders, but I think it's also important that all of those the companies are nurturing the next generation of leadership. So we don't ever have to look outside our own country to find a leader for a company. And I know that Lunchbox has an associate artist company. Or is that actors? Is that leadership, or is it the whole gamut?
Well, this is our new sort of pilot program that I mentioned briefly before. I'm really excited about it. So this one is all geared for not on stage artists. There's actually no actors in it, though some of them are also actors in addition to what they're doing. But we have a director, a playwright, a dramaturg. One of our assistant stage managers is part of the program, 2 designers, and a production manager. And so each of them directly mentors with one of the 3 core staff. So as artistic director, my 3 are the director, the playwright, and the dramaturg. The 2 designers and the production manager are working with Anton, our production manager. And the ASM is working with Patty, our general manager, who was a stage manager for many years before she shifted into administration. So what they're doing is they're with us for the whole season. And we meet with the whole cohort once a month so that they can really understand how the overall company is working. And then they also work on the shows as they come along. So my assistant director was in rehearsal with me for the show we're about to open. And they're not necessarily with us full time, like the kind of structure of an assistant director, but more like getting to shadow, but also getting to like ask questions and contribute ideas, certainly. And then the assistant director or assistant designers doing a similar thing, working with our designers. So they get to really see the whole process in action, but they get to see it on 4 shows over the course of the season. And then also get to be let in on overall how the company works, which I think it's not necessarily directly kind of leadership residency, but I think that knowing how the whole thing works and will lead to artists who understand better where their place is, and the ones that want to explore more leadership will actually have a chance to know what that even means. But I think if you just get brought in as like an assistant designer on one show, it's neat and you get to learn from that designer on that show. But how do you how do you learn what's next? You know? And I firmly believe, even though so many artistic directors and artistic leaders do come from sort of the directing discipline, there's no requirement that we need to be directors. Like leadership can come from anywhere. And so I think having that whole cohort get to kind of see and get to know the leadership team at Lunchbox through the season, I'll be interested to see which of them do, as they grow into themselves as artists, like figure out that leadership is as a larger concept is something they're interested in. Last year, we got to apply we were successful in applying for a particular leadership residency grant that's available here in Alberta from this foundation called the Rosé Foundation. It's kind of similar in Ontario to the Metcalf Foundation grants. I don't know if you know those. But because of that, we were able to have an emerging artistic leader be kind of my mentee for the whole season. And that was more of an artistic leadership training. And that was awesome. And I hope we get to do it again. I know I talked to the person in charge over there and asked them, like, can we apply right away? And he was like, well, we kind of want to spend that and spread that money around and make sure it's really about the relationship between the mentee and the organization too. So it's not really on me to be like, this is something we always do and people just apply for the thing. It's more like when in conversation with an emerging artist or an emerging artistic leader, if they feel like spending time at Lunchbox would really benefit them, then I know it will benefit Lunchbox. And so then we can apply for that grant. And I'm hoping that maybe we can do that like every other year or something. But it's still a new program, so I'm not sure, how long they'll be funding it and all that stuff. But it's so important. I had the chance in Ontario to do one of those Metcalf grant internships. And I did that with Eric Coates at GCTC in Ottawa for a year. And it's a huge part of my learning and that has brought me to this role now. Like I constantly am thinking sort of what would Eric do as I do my work here. And I'm just, so valuable. And I don't know how you learn it without getting to actually work with a mentor and witness it.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned, bringing all of these, your cohort together and have them with you for so long and learning about how everything works. They're not just and I think what is great about that, I think, is not just that they're not just learning one job, but they're learning how all of the jobs relate to each other, which is so important. It's all well and good to learn how to be a designer, but you also need to know how the designer talks to the director and how the designer talks to the stage manager and how all of those relationships can work. Otherwise, you will only know one aspect of the job and you'll learn the rest the hard way.
Well, for sure. And I think that benefits everyone, no matter which discipline you're in. But also, as I said, like, to become an artistic leader, you kind of need to know what everybody's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, tell me about the Old Dog's New Tricks project.
Oh, this is so neat. So this is headed up by Natasha from Theatre New Brunswick, and a whole bunch of other cool artists from across Canada, like a working group that came together, I think mostly out of Pat's Environmental Stewardship Committee, is kind of that's where this project kind of emerged. But it's a project exploring sustainable design. And they got a grant from the Canada Council, one of those sector innovation and development grants. And so I think it's 10 companies from across Canada are participating this year. And we've been kind of tasked with trying out more sustainable practices on one of our shows. And they kind of have left it to us, understanding that each company is in a really different situation in so many different ways, whether that's the size of our venue or, what, like, geographically where we are or the kind of show we're working on. So they haven't told us you need to make a carbon neutral show or you need to do a buy nothing new show, or, they haven't told us that. But what they did do is at the beginning of the project, they set up 4 webinars to be as kind of a inspiration point for us to learn and take that into our work. And then we have access to some mentorship with them. And then, each company kind of creates their own set of parameters and a bit of a creative agreement of how they want to do this. And it's been really cool to those webinars were just really great resources. And I think there's recordings available. So maybe I can send you them and you can put the link in the show notes or something. But to think about our practice and, whether it's a question of like, oh, this play is just contemporary modern dress, so we could very easily just shop for all the costumes in the mall. But fast fashion has these kinds of environmental impacts, and even if the clothes are cheap, is that actually a good choice? Maybe instead we should be going to thrift stores. But if we go to thrift stores for these clothes, maybe we're going to have to drive all over Calgary, and that's going to be a lot more carbon with the drive. And so it's just been really interesting. It's not like there's one way to make your design more sustainable. But it's been really great to learn all about. Oh, there he is.
There he is.
That's Horatio. Hey, Horatio, it's okay. Sorry, someone's making noise out there.
Of course.
Oh my goodness, he's so loud. Rishi, it's okay. Oh, then. So there's not one way to make your show or your theater company more sustainable. And let's be honest. I know that if the entire Canadian theater sector became green, quote unquote, whatever that is, tomorrow, we're not going to stop the climate crisis.
Yes.
I understand that. But we are storytellers. And so if we can actually tell the story of the things we're doing differently and reach audiences, whether it's in the play, it's part of the story, or whether it's a note in the program about how we did the play, or whether it's something that's on our social media, that's what we are, is we're storytellers. Can we help? I don't know that we can stop the climate crisis, but can we help by harnessing our power as storytellers? And so that's a thing that I'm really excited about this project. And then my understanding is all 10 companies will share what they did. And so other companies can learn and be like, oh, actually, some things are just a system swap. Sometimes it's just, just use this kind of lighting instrument instead of that lighting instrument. There are things you can do But, and then other things, it's like, my designer for this show that we open tomorrow, she attended those webinars, and we all did. That was a neat thing too about this project, is they wanted the artistic leadership of the company and the show director and the designers and the production managers all to be attending it, so that we could all kind of get on board with the conversation and not just be like, oh, hey, designer, can you just do this better? No, we all need to know how we're trying to make it better. But yeah, those conversations really inspired her, and she came up with this design that is beautiful and elegant. It doesn't use a lot of material. And then when she was figuring out exactly how to scale it and build it with our production manager, they were like, oh, well, there's no need to make it that size when we could just make it an inch bigger or smaller or whatever. And then the lumber is way more reusable afterwards, and if we do the joints in this way, it's very easy to pull it apart and actually use it rather than it going in the dumpster.
Right.
So it's just planning how to build it better. And again, sometimes it's figuring out that thrift stores are good. Sometimes it's figuring out that the mall is good, but it's just actually asking the question. And mainly, I think the number one thing to make things more sustainable in terms of design and in terms of what our practices, is actually just giving the time to the question. We are so pressed for time always in Canadian theater, and it's a bit crazy. And we don't there's always well, I've got this problem. I can solve it with more money or more people or more hours, Can we start earlier, and then we don't have to necessarily throw more people or money at it? We could just give it some more hours, and then we can do it better.
Yeah.
It's easier said than done, I know. But yeah, it's a really cool project. We're excited to be part of it. And I don't know exactly yet how it all went on this first show. I know that we did those things, and that the designers were really on board with that. And we did a lot of, it's people in an airport. So we needed a bunch of different backpacks and things. So we actually crowdsourced all those from the team and just found the ones that felt like the closest to the character. But those things are being rented from each person who loaned them, and they're on insurance and all that stuff. So we're doing it with care, not just, hey, can we use your backpack? Trying to do it with some formality and with some care. But we don't need to buy a new backpack for someone to sling it around, for 2 seconds at the beginning of a play. Right? Yeah.
It's, you sort of talked about the way that, the theater is always, it's a treadmill of production, right? It's always going, which has often, I don't know if sometimes it's prevented us from having those conversations, but sometimes that treadmill has acted as a bit of an excuse for not having important conversations, whether it's diversity, whether it's sustainability. It's just, we're just doing this thing and we got to get through it. And it's important to have and to take the time to have all of those conversations. So I'm glad that this is something that's happening with Lunchbox and with other companies as well, to have this sustainability conversation and to put effort and time into it.
Yeah. No, that's exactly it. It's such a treadmill. But we stopped that treadmill for the last couple of years, and we're starting it back up. And unfortunately, most people seem to be starting it back up at a higher setting than it was at before.
Yeah.
And it's did we learn anything here? I don't know. I hope that we did.
Yeah.
And I know we at Lunchbox are trying to really implement the things we've learned. And, we're not perfect by any means. But we're trying.
I think that, starting up the treadmill again is, it doesn't have to be that way. We had time to pause and think, and we had lots of important conversations. And then to start things up again, and to ignore all the conversations that we had and all of the time that we took and all of the thinking that we did is super short-sighted.
Yeah.
I do know that, and one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because it feels to me like a kind of a result of the pause and really a smart way to work, is that it's important to you to build an environment that's nurturing and playful, and productivity comes later, at the same time. But you need the other two as a base before you can really have good productivity. Is that a new thing for you, or is that how you've always operated?
I think it's become more conscious now. I think it is generally how I tried to operate before. I don't know if I was always that successful, especially if it was a more high pressured environment or a harder project. I might have not done as good a job as I hoped I would. But having had this time to reflect and also being the person in artistic leadership, like, rather than being sort of a gigging director all the time, though I still happy to do that if anyone wants to hire me. But like, because I have that sort of relationship to the company as well, it's really important to me to not only create an environment like that in my own rehearsal hall, but for the overall company, and to see that relationship. And I just think the productivity, it's not that it comes later, it actually comes better if you do it this way. I think there needs to be, people need to feel supported. Their needs need to be met, and they need to feel actually like they really can express those needs, and everybody's needs are different. And if their needs are met and there is room for play and collaboration and fun, then the productivity will happen. You don't have to always start exactly at 10, right on, like sometimes, people have been doing check-ins for years, but like doing it in a way where it's really, really listen to the people,
Yeah.
make sure they actually have what they need, not doing it because you feel like, oh yeah, people are doing check-ins these days.
Well, Bronwyn, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me tonight. It's been a pleasure to get to know you and to learn about Lunchbox Theatre.
Oh, thank you so much, Phil, for having me. I'm very proud of the things we're doing. So it's nice to be able to tell the story of it. And I know, it's nice. I appreciate this podcast to help connect artists from across our land here, across Turtle Island, finding out what everybody's up to.
This has been an episode of Stageworthy. Stageworthy is produced, hosted, and edited by Phil Rickaby. That's me. If you enjoyed this podcast and you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can leave a 5-star rating. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can also leave a review. Those reviews and ratings help new people find the show. If you want to keep up with what's going on with Stageworthy and my other projects, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to philrickaby.com/subscribe. And remember, if you want to leave a tip, you'll find a link to the virtual tip jar in the show notes or on the website. You can find Stageworthy on Twitter and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website with the complete archive of all episodes at stageworthy.ca. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby, and as I mentioned, my website is philrickaby.com. See you next week for another episode of Stageworthy.